All right, we're on record. So when we talk about the endocrine system, it's one of two systems that's responsible for homeostasis. In other words, when we talked about the nervous system, we talked about the fact that we need receptors, an integration center, and some sort of response. Those are all components to a negative feedback mechanism. The endocrine system works very similarly, but instead of using electricity and neurotransmitters, it's going to use the circulatory system and hormones. In some cases, the messenger, hormones, and neurotransmitters can be the same chemical messenger, but they'll be delivered either through the circulation, in the case of the endocrine system, or at a synapse, in the case of the nervous system. But if it's the same messenger and matches up with the same receptors, the effects are going to be the same. So we'll see a couple of examples of that when we talk about some of the examples in the endocrine system. But the other thing about the endocrine system to realize is it's not really organized the way some systems are. You know, the heart and the blood vessels are a closed system, so they're very easy to visualize as a system. The endocrine system is really a series of cells all over the body, but they operate in a similar way to be part of the endocrine system. So typically what we say when we talk about an endocrine system is the group of cells in one location create a messenger, in other words, a hormone, introduce it to the circulatory system to target another group of cells somewhere else in the body. So that's kind of, if it falls into that sort of description, it's likely part of the endocrine system. So organs of the endocrine system, they're small and they're separated all over the body. And the chemical messenger that they utilize, we call a hormone. And that's a chemical substance that is going to be secreted by that group of cells into the circulatory system and regulate effects on another group of cells somewhere else in the body. So we've got hormones, otherwise known as a chemical messenger, produced by one group of cells released into a circulation, and that's usually blood, to travel somewhere else in the body. And the target cell is clearly going to have a receptor for that particular hormone. So some of these hormones are protein-based or amino acid-based hormones. And they're usually pretty big. And they can't cross the plasma membrane of a cell. So they need what's called a second messenger. We'll talk about that in a minute. So they need a second The other category of hormones are the steroid-based hormones. And because they're steroid-based, they're lipid soluble. So they can cross the plasma membrane. So the idea here that I'm maybe not making very clear at this point is that if a amino-based hormone finds a target, a group of cells that represent its target, it's going to match with a receptor on the outside of the cell to create changes on the inside using a second messenger system. We'll talk more about that in a couple more minutes. If it's a steroid-based hormone, because that means it's lipid soluble, right? Steroids were a category of lipid molecules. They can cross the plasma membrane. So they can get inside the cell and change the effects of that cell by crossing the plasma membrane. And they either get carried to the nucleus to signal the nucleus, or the fact that they get inside the cell, the presence of them alone is enough to change the signaling to that particular nucleus so that the effects of that hormone are realized. So we've got protein-based and we've got lipid-based hormones, and their mechanism of action is going to be a little bit different. So we'll talk a little bit more about that second messenger system when it comes up with some specific hormones that we want to talk about. And our control, like in the nervous system, control is based on negative feedback. So typically when a signal is called for that increases the production of a hormone, that elevated level of the hormone will in turn become a negative feedback stimulus for continued production of that hormone. So the hormone will be increased and decreased between upper and lower limits. So it looks a lot like our homeostatic wave. So we need a stimulus that will produce the hormone, and then a response that represents what will require a negative feedback mechanism to control continued production of that hormone. So when we talk about the effectiveness of a hormone, there's a couple things we want to be aware of. For a hormone to be effective, we have to have enough of the hormone. That should be fairly straightforward. So let's keep it simple. We'll be talking about it more specifically probably next week. But insulin lowers blood glucose. So if there isn't enough insulin, we might not lower enough glucose. All right. So that's what we mean by the amount of hormone. Simply, is it going to match what the stimulus is to correct the problem? So the amount of hormone, and that means more or less. And the other thing to keep in mind is the numbers of receptors. So our cells are amazing. Some of you might have read about this in some of your chemical messenger assignments that you're doing. But cells, if cells are in need of a particular signal from a particular hormone, they have the ability to upregulate receptors. In other words, they can put more receptors in their cell membrane. So in case the amount of hormone isn't enough, another way to address that is to increase the numbers of receptors. So even if the hormone doesn't go up, if the receptors do, what amount of hormone is circulating has a better chance of matching up with the receptor. Does that make sense? Do you follow me on that? So receptors can be upregulated, which means we'll put more in the plasma membrane, or they can be downregulated. So if there's less need for the hormone, we'll downregulate, take some of the receptors out. So plasma membranes of cells are very dynamic. We know that. And one of the ways that they're dynamic is by this upregulation and downregulation of receptors. And the other factor, just to be generally aware of, we're not going to talk too much about this, but hormones circulate in the blood and they have a lifetime, active period of time, and it's described as being their half-life. So they might get released from a gland and they might have a half-life of 2 hours or 2 days. In other words, after 2 days, their quality of effectiveness is going to be significantly reduced, either because it's being degraded or it's been excreted by then. So that's what half-life refers to. But the first two components are the ones we want to be generally a little more aware of. So let's take a look at this. I think this is on some other, I don't know where that's coming from there. But if this is our plasma membrane of the cell, okay? So here's our nucleus. Now the cell has receptors on it. So let's build a couple of receptors. So here's a receptor here that looks like that. And we'll just take that out of there. And then we've got another receptor that's over here that's shaped like that. So we just draw these this way to recognize that receptors are going to be specific. So if we have a hormone that's circulating around that looks like this, we can appreciate that it will match up with this receptor here, but it will not match with this receptor here. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So if this was a protein-based molecule, like insulin is, I keep using insulin. Insulin's got 51 amino acids. It's way too big to get across a plasma membrane through a channel. You could do it through endocytosis, but we know that costs a lot of energy. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to see that this protein-based hormone, let's use insulin as our example, is going to match up with its receptor. And it's like a lock and a key. It's going to match up with its receptor. And on the inside is a molecule. Now, oftentimes, the molecule is cyclic AMP, which is derived from ATP. After ATP has been used to become ADP, it can become ANP. And that's a message. So when this receptor binds with the hormone on the outside, it causes a change locally in the membrane so that the cyclic AMP breaks away, and it'll travel to the nucleus and signal the nucleus to change its behavior. So this cell starts to change its behavior. But now the cyclic AMP, or sometimes it's calcium, there's different examples of this, but they represent the second messenger. So this is the first messenger, and this is the second messenger. The first messenger never goes inside the cell, but changes the message to the cell by activating the second messenger. Did you follow me on that? Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if it's lipid soluble, remember our phospholipid bilayer, the tails were in the middle and the phospholipid heads were closest to the water, right? So if it's lipid soluble, it can pass between and it gets inside the cell by crossing the plasma membrane directly. So if it's lipid soluble, like our steroid-based hormones, they don't need a receptor on the outside and they don't need to activate a second messenger. They can cross the plasma membrane and influence the cell nucleus or environment inside the cell directly. That's the difference between steroid-based hormones and the protein-based hormones. Okay, so that's mechanism of action. If you're asked questions about mechanism of action, there's two things to talk about: second messengers, or if it's a hormone that's lipid soluble because it's made from a lipid base like steroid ones are, they can utilize that mechanism directly. Now, remember when we were talking about the brain, we said there was a part of the brain that had a direct communication with the endocrine system. And that made sense because we expect the two regulatory systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, to work together, to communicate and work together. So it made sense that there would be an overlap, a place where the nervous system could directly communicate with a main part of the endocrine system. Anybody remember what part of the brain that happened in? Say that again. But what part of the brain?
Oh.
What was the pituitary gland attached to?
Was it the hypothalamus?
Yes, it was the hypothalamus. Excellent, good. Both of you, because the pituitary gland is right, but pituitary gland is actually endocrine. Hypothalamus is nervous. So we said that the hypothalamus, it was a group of cells, a group of neurons, immediately below the thalamus that connected directly to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is this two-lobed endocrine gland that has a bunch of cells in it. Actually, that's the wrong color. We'll put a bunch of different cells in there. And if it's a different cell, it's going to be responsible for producing a different kind of hormone. That's not a big stretch, I don't think. So we've got clusters of cells in the pituitary gland, particularly this part of the pituitary gland. And this pituitary gland is divided into an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. It's connected to the hypothalamus. And remember, the hypothalamus had some endocrine functions associated with it. It had some cells, some special, they call them neuroendocrine cells, so partly nervous and partly endocrine. And what they did is they had axons that finished in the posterior lobe. And there were two distinct groups of neuroendocrine cells that finish in the posterior lobe, and they have axonal endings that instead of being contained, instead of containing neurotransmitters, they contain hormones. Posterior lobe, those hormones were antidiuretic, hormone, and oxytocin. So they are stored in the posterior lobe, but they're produced in the hypothalamus. And the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior division of the pituitary gland is a nervous one. The connection between neurons in the, let's see here, we're going to put another group of neurons up here, different color. And the connection between those neurons And the neurons of and the cells of the anterior pituitary gland is going to be vascular. So this connection right here is called the hypothalamic pituitary stalk. It has other names, but if this name is the best one because it tells us both ends of the communication. Okay, and we've got a vascular component to the anterior lobe and neural to the posterior lobe. Okay, so if it's a vascular component to the anterior, it means that the cells in the hypothalamus are going to release a chemical messenger that's going to influence cells in the anterior pituitary gland. So they're actually producing hormones. So in the case of the posterior lobe, the hormones were produced and remained in the neuron to be stored in the posterior lobe as ADH, antidiuretic hormone, or oxytocin, posterior lobe. In the anterior lobe, we're going to see that there's about 6 hormones that we're going to talk about that come from there. But they're going to be signaled to either increase or decrease by the hypothalamus. And if they're being signaled by messengers that travel in the blood, then by our definition, those chemical messengers are hormones. We okay with that?
So could you just sum up what you just said?
All I heard was a bunch of white noise and a voice somewhere in the background. It was very noisy and I couldn't hear anything you were saying. Try again.
Could you just repeat what you just said?
Yeah, I plan to. Okay, I'm going to show it to you a different way. So we've got 2 ways to look at this. Okay, so this is our hypothalamus. And it communicates with the posterior lobe through a nervous pathway. And it communicates with the anterior lobe through a vascular pathway. Okay, so this is the hypothalamic pituitary stalk, part nervous tissue, part vascular tissue. If it's going to influence the anterior lobe, it's by blood. So it's going to release hormones produced in the hypothalamus that travel through the circulation to the anterior lobe. If it's going to influence the posterior lobe, it's nervous. So this green line just really represents an axon that travels from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the anterior pituitary gland. Posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So this whole thing is pituitary. Does that make sense so far? So ADH and oxytocin are stored in the posterior lobe. I keep saying stored in the posterior lobe. They're not produced there because they were produced in the hypothalamus. The hormones that leave the anterior lobe are going to be produced in the anterior lobe. The hormones that we want to talk about that are going to be produced and released from the anterior lobe are growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, this is a mouthful, this one, adrenocortico trophic hormone. It's abbreviated as ACTH. This one is abbreviated as TSH. This one is abbreviated as GH. So we've got GH, TSH. We've got follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. We've got luteinizing hormone, LH. And we've got another one that's called prolactin. And it doesn't really have a proper abbreviation, so it's just called prolactin. So these are the big ones that are produced and released from the anterior lobe. There are a few others. There's one called melanin stimulating hormone, but that's not a major one in terms of changing metabolic activity in the body. The rest of these are. So we need to talk about each and every one of these ultimately. So we have to understand the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. There's a vascular one and there's a nervous one. The result of the nervous communication is that we store ADH and oxytocin in the posterior lobe. When the time comes to release, they get released just like they would if they were a neurotransmitter leaving an axon. The difference is their destination, once they leave the posterior lobe, is the circulatory system. Then they have to target tissues somewhere else in the body. The anterior lobe produces these hormones that we've listed here and releases them to the circulation for targeting different places in the body. We okay with this so far? Yes, no, maybe?
I'm able to. Are we supposed to learn how to know all this? I'm sorry.
Well, let's review that. Let's review that question. Let's see. We're talking about it.
Okay.
I'm writing it down. I'm asking for questions. What do you think the answer is to that question?
Oh my God.
Well, we're not finished. We're not finished. We're just getting started. So there's gonna be some repetition here.
Okay.
So don't panic about that just yet. What I want you to get from this so far is the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Are we good with the nervous part and the vascular part?
Oh, sir, for the nervous part, you
Yep.
said that those hormones were produced in the hypothalamus, or was
Yep.
it the?
Yep,
Oh,
no,
okay.
hypothalamus. So in this picture up in the corner, right, this is our hypothalamus over here.
Yeah.
So these neurons are in the hypothalamus, and they store these two hormones in their axonal endings,
Okay.
right? And these ones, you see, I try to draw them as separate groups of cells. So they're going to be responsible for producing a hormone and then releasing it
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
to the anterior lobe. So that's the difference between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. They both communicate with the hypothalamus.
Okay, sorry, I just had one more question.
Okay, whatever, I don't know what's in your background, but it's really noisy, so you're gonna have to speak really loudly. Go ahead.
Okay, I just had one more question. So the anterior lobe releases the groups like a neurotransmitter would? Is
The
that
anterior lobe produces and releases these 6 hormones right here.
I meant posterior, sorry.
Posterior stores these 2. So they're produced, those 2 are produced by neurons in the hypothalamus.
Okay, thank you.
So when we take a look at this relationship, so let's take a look at the hypothalamus. And we'll just look specifically at the anterior pituitary gland, okay? Hypothalamus. So we've said now a couple times that the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland is a vascular one. In other words, we're going to have to send chemical messengers from the hypothalamus through the circulatory system to signal the anterior pituitary gland. So those chemical messengers technically can be called hormones because they're being produced in one group of cells and acting on another group of cells. The distance they travel is very short, but they fit the definition. So the thing is that when the hypothalamus signals the anterior pituitary gland, it signals with either excitatory signals, so that more hormone is going to be produced, or inhibitory ones, so that less will be produced. So for example, if we followed growth hormone, if we said growth hormone was going to be released from the anterior pituitary gland, in order for the anterior pituitary gland to produce and release growth hormone, we need to be signaled by growth hormone releasing hormone that came from cells in the hypothalamus. So when growth hormone releasing hormone signals the anterior pituitary gland, the cells that are responsible for making growth hormone are activated, and they produce growth hormone and release it to the circulation from the anterior pituitary gland. And mostly, if the levels of growth hormone get too high, then that will end up sending a negative feedback message back to the hypothalamus. And then the hypothalamus will release something called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And the growth hormone inhibiting hormone will slow down the production of growth hormone. And as a result, growth hormone goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down within upper and lower limits, homeostasis, regulated by negative feedback. I use the dashed line going backwards to visualize negative feedback. Does that make sense? You follow that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So our purple, our nice little teal background is the pathway that gives us a rise in growth hormone. And then the negative feedback goes back to the hypothalamus and we send out the inhibiting factor and it comes down. And if it gets towards its lower limit, we're going to start to release the stimulating factor to bring it up. And as it gets near the top of coming up, we're going to start to inhibit it again. Up and down, reversal of the stimulus. That's the definition of negative feedback. It's the definition of homeostasis. In this case, we're following growth hormone. And growth hormone goes up and it goes down. It goes up and it goes down. If we need to grow, like during childhood, it's mostly up. If in adulthood we need to repair damaged cells and tissues, repair will stimulate growth hormone. We'll see it go up.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the growth hormone still continues to function even after we like reached our like growing limit? It still functions to like for
Yep.
the bones and stuff?
Yep. So I'll explain that when we actually get to the functions of growth hormone. We'll talk a little bit about
Okay.
that. But that's a good question. I know where you're going with that one. Because it does seem a little counterintuitive, right? That it would continue to be necessary after we finish growing. But like I mentioned, for repair, it becomes important for repair. So we're constantly breaking down tissues and things like that. So to play an important role there. So when we're looking about right now, this is just the concept of what's happening with anterior pituitary hormones. They're going to be stimulated by releasing hormones from the hypothalamus and inhibited by inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So we can change growth hormone and put thyroid stimulating hormone in there. We could put ACTH in there. We could put prolactin in there. The concept will be the same. So the other thing to keep in mind is when you see in the terminology and those hormones that I wrote out on that previous slide, okay, growth hormone is also called somatotropin. And adrenocorticotrophic hormone is sometimes just referred to as adrenocorticotropin. Thyroid stimulating hormone tells you it stimulates something. And those hormones that have that word trophic or tropin in them are telling you that they're going to promote growth and development. They're anabolic in their actions. If they're tropins, they're going to probably target another gland and increase its activity. Okay, so that's just a terminology thing to be aware of. If you see that anywhere in the name tropin or trophic, it's going to promote action on another target somewhere. So if we take, for example, growth hormone, so if we want to look at some of the functions for growth hormone targets either directly or indirectly almost every cell in the body. And when it targets cells, it promotes protein synthesis. So it's produced in these cells in the anterior pituitary gland. It's released into the circulation, and most cells in the body have some receptors for this growth hormone. And when the receptors are matched up, those cells start to promote protein synthesis. In other words, they grow. They make more proteins. They get bigger. If it's a muscle cell, it's going to get bigger and stronger, and so on. So these cells not only will increase in size, but they'll also divide. So it's also sometimes described as being mitogenic, which means it increases mitosis. So if it's in growing skeletal tissue or growing muscular tissue, it's going to make more cells representing more growth. So not just increase in size, which you get with protein synthesis, but also increase in numbers. But when we say mostly all cells or almost all cells, particularly skeletal and muscle tissue. So that's the primary target. So that's for the person that was asking about this. That's why it's very important during childhood growth times, and arguably not quite as important in adulthood. But still, we'll see. We're not going to spend much time on it, but with pathologies, if you don't have enough growth hormone, you are going to have some problems. There are going to be some issues that need to be addressed with a deficiency, but particularly so in childhood, but just the same, it's important in adulthood as well. So we've got this function. So it's described as being anabolic because of this protein synthesis and this increase in mitosis as well. Now it also promotes lipolysis, which means it's going to mobilize fatty acids. And that means we have some fatty acids available to make ATP. So, which means that it preserves glucose. In other words, raise blood glucose levels. Because if we can utilize fatty acids to make ATP, we can spare the glucose. And that's good. Some cells, as we know, the neurons in particular, can only use glucose. They can't use the fatty acid. So if we spare the glucose, we make more available for the central nervous system, and we use the fatty acids for other cells in other parts of the body. And so blood glucose levels are maintained or even increased. So it's an example of a hormone that is hyperglycemic. It can raise blood glucose levels. Now, growth hormone doesn't really do this all the time directly. What it typically does is target the liver. So what really happens, or what typically happens, is growth hormone targets the liver, and the cells in the liver, which we already know do things like gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis and glycogenesis, all those things, but they also produce IGFs. And IGFs are like intermediaries. So the liver is targeted by growth hormone. If the growth hormone causes the liver to produce these IGFs, and these IGFs are able to target all the different cells in the body, like the skeletal muscle and the bones and in the body, to promote these things that we've been talking about: protein synthesis, lipolysis when it targets the adipose tissue, and so on. So the growth hormone acts directly to mobilize fats from fat deposits in the blood, but through the IGFs to cause growth in skeletal muscle bone tissue. So we know that it's going to be regulated by the releasing factors from the hypothalamus and the inhibiting factors from the hypothalamus. So basically what's going to happen is as the circulating levels of growth hormone and or the IGFs, if they get too high, then that's going to cause the hypothalamus to release the inhibiting hormone. If the levels get too low, the releasing hormone gets released. Now, additionally, growth hormone does have what's called a circadian rhythm, a natural rise and fall throughout a 24-hour cycle. So the time when growth hormone is often at its greatest, naturally at least, at its highest levels, are in the early evening as you go to bed, sleep. So you might have had a mom who used to tell you, go to bed so that you'll grow up big and tall. And there's some truth to that. Like some of these phrases that moms and grandmoms, maybe great-grandmoms use, have some basis in anatomy and physiology. So we know that you grow and repair much more effectively during your sleep cycles of your 24-hour day than you do during your wake cycles. So this growth hormone has a highest sort of rise and fall in the early evening into the first part of your sleep cycle. And that's when repair is going to be most effective and when a lot of growing is going to occur. And like that other person mentioned, I don't have names in front of me, so I can't call you by name. But the growth hormone secretion is going to be greater during childhood and adolescence, especially during those rapid growth rates during adolescence. And then it's going to decline naturally with age. Okay, now with hormones, the pathologies sometimes just illustrate the normal functions. So you can have too much growth hormone, and if you have too much growth hormone as a child, guess what happens? Too much growth hormone before skeletal maturity.
Your organs are too big?
Well, I said before skeletal maturity. So what's the first thing you should be thinking about?
Maybe very tall, taller than.
Yeah. Literally, the condition, too much growth hormone in somebody who's still growing is called gigantism. And the opposite is true. If you don't have enough growth hormone, it's called pituitary dwarfism. Now, the person that mentioned your organs get too big, that's going to be true. But it's probably, well, it will be true, but the most noticeable feature is going to be the height. Now, if you have extra growth hormone after skeletal maturity, in other words, in an adult, that's not going to be so obvious. But what will be obvious is that the bones will get thicker. The fingers will get more stubby. The chin will get thicker. The forehead gets thicker. There's been some actors who've been able to make a career out of their appearance because of that. And some that, for example, go into wrestling and different things like that to take advantage. The pituitary dwarf is very different than the dwarf you typically see, which is called an achondroplastic dwarf. That's a genetic abnormality that results in a disproportionate growth. In pituitary dwarfism, they're small but proportionate. They might only be 3.5 or 4 feet tall, but they don't have the disproportionate limb length versus the trunk that you see with the other type of dwarf, the more common visual dwarf. So those I don't want you to spend any time on because those are pathologies. We take those up when we talk about pathology in HDP 301 and 401. That's third and fourth semester stuff. That understand that if you have too much or too little, you're going to have an effect. So if you haven't finished growing, you're going to become a giant with too much, or you'll become a dwarf if you don't have enough. If you've already reached skeletal maturity, it's not going to affect your height, but it will affect your organs. They'll get thicker. Your tongue might get thicker. If your heart gets thicker, it can cause it to stop. So it becomes life-threatening. So it needs to be treated. Right, so you follow me okay with that?
Okay, sir.
You're okay with what growth hormone does? And we're not too worried, other than just understanding the basics of what would happen if there was too much or too little. Because we're not going to focus on that because that's pathology. We just want to focus on normals as much as possible. So this section right here that you can see right here, those are 3 or 4 or 5 functions for growth hormone. You know by now, if I ask you a question, the most I might ask you is to give me 2. Right, so if you can remember a few of the functions, and if you remember the pathway, you've got it all figured out for growth hormone. And the good news is, for the 6 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland, the concepts are going to be the same every time. They're going to be repetitive. And even better news, we're not going to talk about FSH or LH in this class because those are reproductive hormones. And we talk about them when we do the reproductive system in ANP100. So, for example, what I'm talking about now is the next hormone that's being produced and released from the anterior pituitary gland. So here's our hypothalamus. Here's our anterior pituitary gland. Okay, the next hormone we're going to talk about is called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone. And we know that it's going to be stimulated by a hormone that's produced and released from the hypothalamus. And it's going to travel in circulation to from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary gland, where the cells, a different group of cells, produce thyroid stimulating hormone. And what gland do you think the thyroid stimulating hormone is going to target?
The thyroid gland.
That would be a very good guess. Yes. And what do you think it's going to do to the thyroid gland?
Secretion.
Well, keep it simpler than that.
Stimulate.
It's going to stimulate it.
Stimulate it.
Yeah, and when it stimulates it, exactly right. What you said was exactly right, but you're working harder than you need to right away. But it's going to stimulate the production of thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are abbreviated as T3 and T4. T3 is otherwise known as triiodothyronine. That's a mouthful. And T4 is called thyroxine. Now, we'll talk a little bit about those in a second, but let's just look at thyroid stimulating hormone first. Thyroid stimulating hormone, to be produced and released from the anterior pituitary gland, has to be stimulated by a messenger from the hypothalamus. It's called thyrotropin, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. So it's called thyrotropin releasing hormone. When it gets released from the hypothalamus, it targets the anterior pituitary gland to produce and release TSH. TSH targets the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones. The abbreviations for the thyroid hormones are T3 and T4. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the words, but I do expect you to remember T3 and T4. If I put them together, it will never be, never be to trick you. It'll always be the correct matchup. So if you're looking at a multiple choice question, it isn't going to be a mismatch to try to trick you. Okay. So thyroid stimulating hormone is about stimulating the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. So stimulates what are called follicular cells in the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. So that's pretty easy for TSH. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. The name tells you what it does. The name tells you what its target tissue is. So it's a great name and an easy one to remember as far as that goes. So it's going to promote growth and development of the thyroid gland. If you get a lot of TSH, it might make the thyroid gland grow big, which would be a goiter. There's another way to get a goiter, but it's because of a deficiency for a different mechanism, but the gland is getting bigger in either case. Now, in this case, it would be nice if the other messenger was just called TIH, thyrotropin inhibiting hormone. But the reality is that it's growth hormone inhibiting hormone that will decrease TSH production. So, and again, I'm not going to ask you questions like that, but just because you're probably going to read a little bit about this, I hope, before 2 weeks from now. But growth hormone inhibiting hormone would decrease TSH and TRH would increase TSH. And again, negative feedback on the way back. So if we follow the green, all the green is increasing action. It's trophic. Yeah, which way would do you want to finish up with the talking about the anterior pituitary hormones, or do you want to follow through and talk about the thyroid gland while we're on this topic? We can do it. We can either separate and talk about the thyroid hormones separately, and so talk about the other pituitary hormones, or follow this all the way through to the end. Which way would you like to do it?
Either way.
Either way. Okay, well, let's follow through with the thyroid gland. Let's do it that way. Then we're staying on topic. So the thyroid gland, that's a gland that's found in the anterior part of your neck. And it's kind of got two lobes. It's described as being a bilobed gland, very, very vascular, which makes sense because we're going to be producing and releasing hormones into the circulatory system. So it's the anterior part of the neck, and it's just below your voice box, just below your larynx. And it's the largest endocrine only gland in the body. So we've got other glands that are bigger, but they have other responsibilities, like the pancreas, for example. So this is a large two-lobed gland in the anterior cervical area. And it's made up of follicular cells. So what these follicular cells are, the follicular cells are cells that form they form follicles. So, and follicles will be clusters of these follicular cells. So the whole gland is made up of clusters of these cells. So under a microscope, you would see multiple follicles formed by these follicular cells. And in the center of these follicular cells is something called thyroglobulin. So these produce thyroglobulin. And the thyroglobulin is made up of some carbohydrates, and some proteins that create this sort of gel-like fluid. And this thyroglobulin attracts iodine. So if you look up at the top there, you can see the T3 is called triiodothyronine. So how many molecules of iodine do you think is in one molecule of T3?
3.
3,
Yeah. And what about T4?
4.
Exactly. That's where the terminology comes from. So, and it's also why iodine is such an important molecule to get from our diet. We can't produce iodine. We have to get it from our diet. And in North America, especially around the Great Lakes, which is where we are, the soil is particularly low in iodine. So there's a potential to be deficient in iodine. If a baby is born deficient in T3, T4, they can become mentally delayed, severely mentally delayed. And they can have all kinds of growth disturbances and so on. And we'll see a little bit why when we look at the functions, but right now we're looking at production.
I have a question.
Okay.
This might be a little bit off topic. Is that why they give you iodine pills and like when there's like a nuclear catastrophe?
Wow. I did not know that that's what they have to do during a nuclear catastrophe. Thankfully,
No, because
I've never been in one, so I guess I haven't had to worry about it.
no,
So-
because I know like in the Soviet times, like my family's from Ukraine, so my
Yes.
dad was beside Chernobyl. They gave them iodine pills.
Oh, okay. So you know what? I think that I'm gonna look into that, but I don't think that's for the thyroid hormones. I'm guessing that the
Okay.
iodine probably neutralizes some of the radioactive changes that have happened in some of the cells.
Mhm.
I'm not 100% sure,
Okay.
but that's a really interesting. You've come from a very interesting part of the world, that's for sure, and
Yeah.
had to deal with some really interesting stuff, and not all of that's in a good way, I'm sure. But at any rate, I'm going to check into that a little bit because I'm sort of vaguely aware of that utilization for something that has more to do, I think, with radioactivity.
Okay, because I thought it's just like to protect, like, because
Yeah,
then you would like lose a lot of iodine,
right, yeah.
and
it
that would
could be-
kind of
that
lead
could
to
be.
cancer.
Yeah, oh, yeah, and we know that that's what happens with the exposure to the radiation.
Mhm.
But in this case,
Okay.
what we've done in North America, in the Great Lakes region, is that we've fixed the low iodine in the soil by adding iodine to our table salt. When you might notice that when you buy table salt in the store, it's described as being iodinized. In other words, it's had iodine added to it because we get plenty of salt. And if we get some iodine with our salt, we have enough iodine for our thyroid hormones to be produced. Are you familiar with our table salt, NaCl being iodinized?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've heard of that before. Okay, so at any rate, we don't need a lot because we're pretty good at recycling these hormones too, and we particularly the iodine from the recycling. So you don't need an awful lot in order to make sure you've got enough for your thyroid hormones. But without it, you're going to have a deficiency, and that's going to be a problem in adulthood, but particularly a problem in childhood. If you're born with a deficiency, it can be very developmentally harmful. And if it's for too long in infancy, it can be irreversible mental retardation and irreversible growth disturbances. So most babies in North America are tested right away in their first blood testing that gets done right after they're being born. They're tested for their thyroid hormone levels. And if they're deficient, then they're going to be supplemented with iodine right away. It's a great solution, right? Because it's completely reversible if it's caught early. So it can save a lot of grief in that child's lifetime. So the other thing is that so these are the follicular cells. But there's also some cells that are nearby those cells that are called the parafollicular cells. Now, does anybody have any idea what the parafollicular cells might produce that we've talked about before?
Parathyroid?
Close, but no cigar. What was the antagonist to that? You said parathyroid, right? Parathyroid?
Yes.
You remember what the antagonist hormone to parathyroid hormone was called?
No.
How about now?
Calcitonin?
Yeah, calcitonin. So calcitonin is produced by cells in the thyroid gland to lower blood calcium levels. So a completely different group of cells with a completely different function, but still a very important function. If we remove part of the thyroid gland to try to solve a thyroid problem, we might create a bone calcium problem, right? Or a blood calcium problem. Now we'll find out a little bit later that the parathyroid hormones are produced by a group of cells on the back of the thyroid gland, not in the thyroid gland proper. They're on the back of the thyroid gland. So I think we talked about those already when we talked about calcium metabolism, but basically they're not part of the thyroid gland directly. So these hormones, T3 and T4, are major metabolic hormones. So we, just like epinephrine and norepinephrine, we lump them together. And the reality is that the follicular cells produce both T3 and T4. T4 is a little more stable in the circulation, but before it becomes active, it has to drop one of those iodines. More information than you need to know, but just that's why we keep them together like this, T3 and T4. You don't need to know the difference. Just keep them together. Talk about them as a group. So the hormones, T3 and T4, are going to be produced and released by the thyroid gland. And again, target almost all cells to promote oxygen uptake. So there's more functions than just this, but when it targets virtually every cell in the body, with just a very few exceptions, it's going to promote oxygen uptake. Now, what do you think is important about promoting oxygen uptake? In other words, we're bringing more oxygen into the cell. Why would that be important?
Cells reproduction.
Pardon me?
for reproduction.
Oh, man. Oh, man. Oh, man. Come on.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're not. I don't mean you. You're being a representative to the class right now, so it's not personal.
Is it to keep the cell alive?
Yeah.
ATP
Is it for energy?
Oh,
or
yay!
ATP.
Yay! Yay! Do you know what I'm saying yay to? Which answer?
ATP.
Energy.
ATP.
ATP.
Yeah.
Why do we breathe? For ATP. Why do we eat? For glucose to make ATP. We breathe for oxygen to make ATP. We have this hormone that increases oxygen uptake to get more oxygen inside the cell. Why? For ATP. And yes, that will improve reproduction. And yes, that will improve life. But those are not the correct answers. The correct answer is ATP. We have it.
Yes.
So that's going to allow us to make more ATP. We know that ATP is our currency for energy. It's what we use to make energy as most efficiently as possible. Now, what happens when we use a lot of ATP? You've seen this equation. We get ADP, we get that phosphate group. What else do we get? We get energy, and we get what?
Heat.
Heat. So guess what? This group of hormones contribute to thermal regulation. In other words, specifically by increasing temperature. And the mechanism for increasing temperature is what we've got over here. So if you're cold and you start to shiver and you start to, the hypothalamus monitors your temperature and says, well, we got to get warmer. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone. And we're going to make more ATP. We're going to use that ATP when we shiver, and we're going to create heat. So it's an important thermal regulator. If we make more ATP and we're more busy, what we're saying is we're increasing basal metabolic rates. And that's also explained by this equation over here. So we're increasing our basal metabolic rates. We're going to increase our temperature. It's an important hormone. For normal growth and development. Because it targets all those cells to promote ATP production, it's going to promote growth and development of all those cells and tissues that it targets. It regulates tissue growth and development, especially in the skeletal system, the nervous system, and the reproductive systems. It promotes protein synthesis. It increases blood glucose. So it's another hormone that increases blood glucose. You're going to see this as a common theme, because when we get to insulin, it's going to illustrate how important insulin is, because insulin is the only hormone that lowers blood glucose significantly, and all these other ones raise it. So it tells you two things. One thing is it must be really important to maintain blood glucose higher rather than lower, because we got all these hormones that are going to do that for us. And the second is that insulin must be pretty important because it's the only one that can establish negative feedback if blood glucose levels gets too high. And if we have a problem with insulin, we have a pathology because we don't have a backup. And one of the mechanisms that increases blood glucose levels by is similar to what we talked about with growth hormone. It promotes lipolysis, so it makes free fatty acids available for ATP production, and that spares the glucose. So the glucose is available for the central nervous system, for example. So T3 happens to be lipid soluble, so it can cross the membrane. Growth hormone was protein, so it needed a second messenger for action. And a lot of times that second messenger essentially was those insulin-like growth factors produced by the liver. So here we've got lipid soluble hormones. They can cross the plasma membrane. So knowing what the thyroid hormones do, you can very quickly predict what would happen with too much or too little. Again, we don't want to spend too much time on this, but with too much thyroid hormone, guess what? You're going to get hot. You're going to be very intolerant to heat because you're making so much heat. You're going to be agitated. You probably will be tired, but you can't sleep because of this increase in T3 and T4. Your metabolic rates are high, so you're hot. If you don't have enough, if you're hypothyroid, then you're going to feel cold. You'll probably gain weight rather than lose weight. That sort of thing. If you're a newborn baby and you don't have enough thyroid, there's a very serious condition that's going to develop. It's called cretinism. And that's the one we were talking about, where there's mental retardation and disproportionate growth, weak muscular development, and that sort of thing. But it is reversible when it's caught early enough. And it's simply reversed if the issue was an iodine deficiency, then we correct it with iodine supplement. Okay, so the only thing before we leave the thyroid gland that we should just recall is the functions of calcitonin. And remember, it lowers blood calcium. So calcitonin is a polypeptide, so it's protein based. So it's going to have to use a second messenger system in order to activate. And it's the antagonist to parathyroid hormone. So we know parathyroid hormone therefore raises blood calcium levels. And what we know that the calcitonin does is it decreases osteoclast activity. So less osteoclast breakdown, less calcium being released. And it increases calcium excretion at the kidneys. So we lose more at the kidneys. And we don't break down as much in the bone tissue. The result is that the blood calcium levels go down. Those are the two big ones as far as that goes. Okay. Okay with the thyroid? Maybe while we're on the topic of the thyroid, we should just mention the parathyroid gland. Clusters of cells. Anywhere from 4 to 8 clusters of cells on the back of the thyroid gland. And they produce the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone is responsible for raising blood calcium levels. And it does it 3 ways. It promotes osteoclast activity, promotes reabsorption of calcium at the kidney, stimulates production of vitamin D from pre-vitamin D. Where was pre-vitamin D produced?
Skin.
Yes, very good. And it had to be activated both at the liver and at the kidney. This is where the parathyroid hormone comes into play. And when we increase vitamin D, that promotes absorption of calcium in the small intestine. So we have reabsorption of the kidneys because in order for calcium to get into the system, it has to be absorbed, and that's the job of the digestive system. Once it's in circulation, gets down to the kidneys, it's going to get filtered. And if we're calling for reabsorption, if we're calling for more calcium, we're going to reabsorb. So the terminology is important. At the kidneys, it's a reabsorption because it's already in the circulation due to the digestive system. So that's absorption the first time, reabsorption the second time. Okay, I think by the resounding participation that you've maybe had enough for today.
Yes,
Yes, please, sir.
thank you.